Depart, all ye profane, and close the doors. I will show the thoughts of a wise theology, wherein men symbolize God and God's powers by images akin to sense, and sketched invisible things in visible forms, to those who have learned to read from statues as from books the things there written concerning the gods. And it is no wonder that the utterly unlearned regard the statues as wood and stone, just as also those who do not understand written letters look upon monuments as mere stones, and on tablets as bits of wood, and on books as woven papyrus. So my hope is that throughout the course of this class, we can join Porphyry in his understanding in looking at the statues, the images, and the artifacts left behind by the ancients, and see them not just as bits of stone and not just wood and the material that these things are made of, but that these things actually contained some sort of higher essence to the people who worship the images. They did not simply worship rocks and stones and sticks, as the polemicists often accuse them of. So we're going to delve into this material, and I hope that we all have a good time doing it. My name is Dr. Dan Attrell. I have a PhD in history, an MA in ancient Mediterranean cultures, and a post-baccalaureate in classics. And I am comfortable in both Greek and Roman material, but admittedly, I'm more of a Latinist than I am a Hellenist. My PhD is in Renaissance and medieval studies, so I spent a lot of my time translating Latin works more so than Greek works. But we're going to deal with both of these things in tandem. We're going to deal with Greek and Latin materials side by side. A lot of courses that deal with this kind of material, they tend to do all of the Greek stuff first and then do all of the Roman stuff after. And I don't particularly like that method. So what we're going to do is do them in tandem and try to keep a bit of a chronological and thematic order to the class. So the aim of this course is to familiarize students with Greek and Roman religion, beginning with the period of Homer and ending with the establishment of Christianity as the official religion of Rome in the 4th century AD. By the end of the course, students will be familiar with not only Greek and Roman state religion, but also domestic religion, a variety of foreign mystery cults, mystical philosophies, popular religious beliefs and practices, and you will be asked to discuss and write about these topics critically within their historical and cultural contexts, and learn to engage with the ancient evidence. So art, archaeology, literature, and also deal with modern scholarship, all of the stuff that's been written in the last 200 years or so, or more realistically, the last 50 years, but classics has been a thriving endeavor for well over 2 centuries now. Okay, so caveat. This is a course on ancient religion, but it's not a course on first mythology, which are the stories, legends, and genealogies passed down and preserved about the gods and the heroes. You can note that there is actually another class in the department dedicated to mythology. Now, it's almost impossible to deal with ancient religion without touching on mythology as you go along, but that's not going to be our primary focus. We're more interested in the practices, in what was actually done in order to worship the gods, not just telling stories or what were the stories that parents told their children about the gods. That's related, but it's a separate subject all on its own. Next, we are not going to be looking at theology necessarily, so the systematic study of the gods. So questions like, do the gods exist? Are they good or evil? Which religion should I practice or believe? Was it right for Christianity to triumph over paganism, etc.? These are questions that you can make your own conclusions on your own time, but we're not going to be looking at them because these aren't the kinds of things that you could simply dig up evidence about. These are things that are debated by polemicists, and this is more philosophy, theology. It's a different magisterium. And also, Modern reception is another thing that we are not necessarily going to be looking at very much. This is the enduring role of Greek and Roman gods in popular media, movies, books, video games, etc. And the reason I put this here is because every time I run this course, someone comes and wants to write their paper on such and such a god in this video game, or, I don't know, Assassin's Creed or Rome Total War or something like that. And that stuff's great. And I'm glad that people enjoy it and learn things while playing that. But the intent, the spirit of this class really is to get you to look at ancient materials and ancient sources and not to focus necessarily on modern reception. So it says here, we are more emphatically interested in literature, art, and archaeology about what the Greeks and Romans did for their gods over what they believed about them. Ancient polytheism or paganism was about praxis. It was about what you did, what you performed. It was not really about what you believed. The gods didn't care if you believed in them or not, so long as you did the rituals for them. And that's the kind of thing that we want to look at. So let's jump right into the material then. So what is religion? Modern scholars have many definitions and theories about what religion is, especially 19th and 20th century sociologists and anthropologists. But antiquity was not so obsessed with overanalyzing religion or trying to understand it in a roundabout way. So there are all kinds of ways that we can look at religion. One of them is the structuralist approach, and that's looking, for example, at the kinds of institutions that run religion, looking at the priesthoods and looking at the relationships between different people and the priests. It's looking at the deep structures that constitute religion. There is also the functionalist perspective, which is more about understanding religion for its role and what its function is. So some people might say, it's all about social cohesion. Others more skeptically or cynically might say it's all about controlling the masses. These are functions of religion, but it's not really trying to understand religion on its own terms. There is a Marxist approach to religion. Marx famously said that religion is the opium of the masses, and his approach to religion, from an atheistic point of view, was typically that you have substructures that produce, and then you have superstructures that justify economic relations. And so we're not going to be looking necessarily at that sort of thing. We can do it in passing. It can be one of our many lenses. Marxism looks at who is producing the surplus of calories, for example, in order to allow for things like religion to actually happen. Because without the surplus of calories, without food, you can't have people who are not farmers. And religion is typically done by people, well, not necessarily, but often is done by people who are religious specialists and not agriculturalists. The feminist perspective is another way to look at religion. How is religion used often by men as a patriarchal system to control women's bodies, to make them stay in the gynikeon behind the herm? This is a herm right here, and typically these are the kinds of statues that would sit outside of the home of a Greek. And they often are depicted with these phalluses sticking out of them. And this is kind of a reminder of the phallosocracy, of the power of men, and that women belong in the domestic sphere, in the gynikeon, in the upstairs portion of the house, where they tend to familial duties. They tend to taking care of the slaves and to weaving. And much of the religion of ancient Greece and Rome reflects that fact in what the goddesses are and what are their relationships to the gods. So these are valuable perspectives, but I would rather us take a historicist approach, which is understanding ancient people on their own terms. It's not trying to leverage all of these different sociological or economic theories into trying to understand religion, but it's trying to look at what the ancients thought about the gods themselves. And what we have to admit is that the ancients believed that their gods were real. And so religion, properly speaking, is simply the worship of the gods. That is what religio means. When you look at Cicero, the great orator of ancient Rome, and what he had to say about religion, he says, "We Romans are far superior in religio," that is, far superior than the Greeks, by which I mean the worship of the gods. And the words that he used are the cultus deorum. So cultus is a word that comes from colo, colere, colui, cultus. Those are the four principal parts of the verb. And that means I cultivate, I till, I tend, I take care of, I inhabit, I frequent, I am the guardian of, I cherish, I care for, I protect, I nurture, I worship, I honor, and I revere. This is where we get our word agriculture. Now, for the word religio itself, which they didn't use as often as this word cultus, the etymology for this word is actually quite disputed. Does it come from an unattested verb that we have not surviving in any text, from the verb religo, which means I observe or I venerate? Does it come from the word relego, which means I go over or recite or read again? Does it come from religo, I bind together? Is it something that binds together a community, or even is it some form of mind control that holds you back, that keeps you tied or bound up with these ideas? All of these have been put forward as different etymologies for the word religion, but in any case, etymology does not dictate meaning. What dictates meaning is usage. And if we want to know what the usage of religio is, we have to turn to a classical dictionary, something like the Lewis and Short. It's a dictionary, but when it gives you a definition of a word, it also provides the locus classicus, the place in which you can find that word being used in that way. So every single definition that it gives an instance in classical literature where the word is being used in that sense. And these are the definitions that Lewis and Short offered for religio. One is reverence for God or the gods, the fear of God or the gods, connected with a careful pondering of divine things. It can mean piety, both pure inward piety and that which is manifest in religious rites and ceremonies. It can mean conscientiousness, scrupulousness arising from religion, religious scruples of conscience, religious awe, anxiety, punctiliousness, conscientiousness, or exactness. And then third, it means holiness or sacredness, sanctity inhering in religious objects. So a deity, a statue of a god, a temple. It's only very much later that the word religion came to take on this definition of a system of religious belief, or a religion with its own scriptures, creeds, laws, doctrines, and dogmas. You won't necessarily find creeds or scriptures or doctrines or dogmas in ancient religion. You'll certainly find some laws, but the sacred and secular spheres were so intertwined with one another in antiquity that it's difficult to pin this down to simply religion. So this is an example drawn up from Virgil's Aeneid of the word religio being used. This is when Evander is showing Aeneas around. He's giving him a lay of the land of the site that will eventually become the city of Rome. So Evander led Aeneas to the place of Tarpeia and the Capitol, so where the Capitoline Hill would be, which is now golden, but then was dark with forest undergrowth. Even then, a fearful religio connected with the place pressed on the timid country folk. Even then they trembled at the forest and the rock. This grove, Evander said, this hill with its wooded peak, is inhabited by a god, but what god is unknown. The Arcadians believe that they have often seen Jupiter himself shaking the darkening aegis in his right hand as he stirred up the storm clouds. So, as you can see in the context of this passage, the word religio really doesn't mean a system of creeds or of rules and regulations or of holy books. In this context, it means a sense of religious fear or of awe or of a sense of dread of the supernatural. And that's really the meaning that we're going to be looking at today, especially when we get into the Roman animism. So what about among the Greeks? We've spoken mostly about the Romans, and religio is a Latin word after all. Well, the fact is that the Greeks didn't have a word for religion. What they have instead is a kind of constellation of terms that we can gather together and say that this amounts to their thoughts on religion. So what are some of these terms? We have eusebia, which is piety, that is doing the right thing or doing the correct observances, means sacrificing at the right time, means doing the festivals when that time comes around. It means adhering to what has been passed down to you from your ancestors and not changing anything. That is eusebia. The equivalent in Latin would be pietas. And, there's also asibia, which is impiety or impietas in Latin. And that is simply to shirk your duty or neglect your duty and to disavow what your ancestors practiced and passed down. Next, we have latreia, which is the word for worship, practice, or service. So if you think of the word idolatry, the latry in there is this latreia word. Eidolon is image, and latria is this worship word. So idolatry is the worship of images or statues. Next, we have ta nomizomena, which is the customary things. Nomos in Greek means law, and therefore ta nomizomena are the things that are passed down, that are customary, and that are therefore lawful. We also have the form nomixen tus theus, which is to worship the gods in a customary way. And that is, again, to worship the gods in accordance with the law that is passed down by our ancestors. Then we have theus sebastai, which is to revere or to be in awe of the gods. Thusiai is another word that means sacrifices, and it's actually related to the Indo-European word for smoke, to make smoke. So if you know what a thurible is, the kind of thing that you see at Catholic Church where they're waving it around and it's full of incense and it's billowing that smoke, that is etymologically related to this word. And then we have ta theia, which is things relating to the gods. A similar equivalent in Latin might be sacra, sacred things. But we'll see they're slightly different. So the gist of it is that among the Greeks, there isn't a word for religion, but there is rather a constellation of terms that they use instead. Now, there are some more words that Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who was a historian of Roman antiquities, leaves us with. So this is a Greek historian writing about the Romans in the 1st century BC, and he tells us that when we are considering religion, what we need to do is we need to look at the hiera, which are the sanctuaries or the temples, the temene, which are the sanctuaries, the bomoi, which are the altars, and this is etymologically related to the word for cow, because that is the chief animal that was sacrificed on altars. We have koinon hydruseis, which is cult statues, heortai, which is festivals, ekekeriai, which are holidays, ponon anapaulai, which is rest from work. So the Latin equivalent would be feriae, or these are holidays, time off work. The problem is you don't really get time off work necessarily, because then you're just expected to perform your religious duties. But people enjoyed it, and that's what they spent their time off doing, is doing these various religious festivals that punctuated the cycle of the year. So what are some key features of ancient religion? Generally, ancient religions are polytheistic or animistic. And I will say right out of the get-go that there are exceptions to all of these rules. And of course, ancient Judaism is one example of a monotheistic religion that is also ancient, that comes out of the Iron Age, but that itself evolved out of a polytheistic and then a henotheistic system. Henotheism means one God at a time-ism. And it's the idea that you believe that there are multiple gods, that they exist, but you only worship one of them. And then it was only over the course of centuries that this idea of many gods existing was done away with, at least within Judaism and Christianity. Next, ancient religions are syncretic. That is to say, they are non-exclusive. They're open to new gods for the most part. The Romans were a bit cautious with accepting new gods, but they did make exceptions for the introduction of new gods. They were just wary of the dangers that were associated with inviting foreign gods into their pomerium, into their sacred space. But syncretic, the word syncretism, means it's something like translation. That is, the Romans saw that the Greeks worshipped Zeus and they worshipped Jupiter themselves. And so they said, he is a sky god. Jupiter is our sky god. They have very much the same profile. They both carry the thunderbolt, and they both have similar stories. And so we say that we each worship the same god, Zeus and Jupiter. But that's not always the case. There's sometimes certain gods like Liber and Dionysus, which are similar forms of one another, but Cicero would deny that. He would say, no, Dionysus is a degenerate. He's a drunken reveler. Liber is about political freedom. He's not about freedom from inhibition or ecstasy or anything like that. So syncretism is a rule, but there are exceptions to the rule. Now, ancient religions are also concerned with orthopraxy over orthodoxy. So ortho means straight. You go to the orthodontist, you get your teeth straightened out. If you are orthodox, it means you follow the right or the straight, the correct path, the right teaching. They didn't have this idea in antiquity necessarily. That had to be generated over the course of centuries. Instead, what they were after was orthopraxy, that is, correct action, correct ritual, doing the proper festivals, doing the correct actions at the sacrifice. It doesn't matter what you believe. Like it says here, it's not the thought that counts. A lot of people think, it's what I have in my heart that matters. It's not what I do out in the world. No, that's not how ancient pagans thought. It was all about what you did. It had nothing to do with what you believed. That is a kind of revolution that happens around the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, whereby faith in gods becomes something important. What was more important to the ancient Greeks and Romans was doing the deeds correctly. So it is performative, it is placatory, that is to say, it is for making the gods happy. It is propitiatory, so you are offering sacrifices to the gods so that they will be propitious towards you and your family. And it is not faith-based. It doesn't matter if you believe in the gods or not. If you're a philosopher and you doubt the existence of the gods, that's fine. Just do the sacrifices. Nobody will think anything of it. It's when you try to tell people that they shouldn't sacrifice because there are no gods, then you're going to get in trouble. There's the healthy middle ground is simply doing the practice and accepting that you don't necessarily have to believe in the gods. Now, another thing about ancient religion is that it wasn't a matter of personal choice. It was a matter of family and community survival. You were born into the religion that you practice, and there weren't really any options, at least until the mystery cults come along in the 1st, 2nd centuries, BC and also AD. That's when you start to see people really deciding what religion that they want to follow themselves, which gods that they want to follow. When you're looking at the classical period, the archaic period, you inherit the religion of your fathers and you have to practice it. There's no choice. There's no alternative options. That is just simply what is expected of you, and that's that. And then another major difference, or rather something that is very different from ancient religion to modern religion, and that is temples. Temples were the homes of the gods. So here we have Olympian Zeus sitting inside of his home, and we have an altar splayed out in front with all of these votive gifts placed on the table, and people are performing sacrifices out in front of the temple. There are people wrestling, implied the Olympic Games, that are done in honor of this Olympian Zeus. And these were the homes of the gods. They were not gathering places for congregants to worship. So you might come to a temple and offer a sacrifice on a specific festival in front of the temple, but you wouldn't go inside like in a church or a synagogue or a mosque and pray to the gods. It was simply a building that was erected, and it was often a building that was very lavish and expensive, and you would come and you would bring offerings for the god, and the god would be satisfied by your piety, by your actions in bringing those gifts, those sacrifices, those offerings to the gods. So that's really something important to think about as we move forward. Another major factor of ancient religion is this Numinous worldview. So we as modern people, by and large, I can't speak for everyone because everybody is different, but our default perspective is this materialistic perspective, that everything is just atoms and chemicals, and we are the sum total of those things. And there's not much room, at least in places like academia, for the spiritual. What there is the material world, and that's it. Well, the ancients didn't believe that at all. They were not materialists. There were a few materialists in antiquity, but by and large, they were hated, and they were not very popular among more religious types of people, which was basically everybody. And so the word numinous derives from the Latin word numen, and this is a word that means divine will or presence. And it's the idea that every person, place, or thing has above it, in a supernatural way, a divine double. So the door has a god associated with it. And the door god, Janus, is not just above and outside the door, but he is the door. So the spiritual and the physical interpenetrate each other in a way that's inextricable. And so that's something that we have to consider, that gods are everywhere. We have what are called genii locorum, and these are the geniuses of a place. So this classroom might have its own genius. This building would have its own genius. The university campus has a genius. There's a river outside in the woods over there, and that has its own genius. It would also have nymphs populating it. And so the idea is that everywhere you go, there are gods associated with everything, these divine doubles. Now, the examples I give are Janus in the doorway. Limentinus was the Roman god of the threshold. So when you enter into a doorway, you never want to cross with your left foot. You always cross with your right foot over the threshold in order not to upset Limentinus. You also don't want to kick the threshold, because if you kick the threshold, you're kicking Limentinus. This is one of the reasons why in certain traditional wedding practices, the husband carries the wife over the threshold and he steps with his right foot and he doesn't trip or kick the threshold, because otherwise that's bad luck for his wedding. So that's kind of a superstition that we've carried over in the Western world that is really derived from these ancient Roman practices. Another is Cardea, who's the goddess of the hinges on the door, or Forculus, which is the door itself. And so just in a doorway, there are already 4 or 5 gods, and that can be extended and applied to almost everything. Every aspect of life is just filled with gods. Now, Gods are intensely local and specific. And so, for example, you have Jupiter, who is the supreme sky god, of course, but then you have Jupiter Capitolinus, the Jupiter of the Capitoline Hill. Or you might have Zeus Ctesios, who is the Jupiter of an individual household. And now, are all these Jupiters forms of the one Jupiter? You tell me. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're thought of as different Jupiters, and every family has its own version of Jupiter or Zeus. And sometimes they are considered in a more conglomerate form as aspects or emanations of Jupiter. You'll find early on in very ancient Roman and Greek religion, you'll have more of this particularity of the divine, where not all of the gods are necessarily aspects or emanations of that one particular god. But later on in, let's say, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century AD, we start to get a different understanding whereby the gods are thought of as emanations of these supreme principles, and that there is an irreducible number of gods up there in this metaphysical space, and that all these different gods below just are aspects or emanations of those higher gods. And gods are gatekeepers of the goods they preside over, and so they demand respect. So let's say you are an ancient Roman farmer, and you're clearing land to make a field that you want to farm, but there's trees there. Well, those trees have divinities associated with them. And now that isn't to say that you aren't allowed to cut down the trees, but what it means is that you need to give something up in order to propitiate the spirit of the tree or the nymph that lives in the tree. And then that will be a kind of reciprocal relationship between you and the gods. You give something to them, and they give something to you. The expression in Latin is do ut des, I give so that you might give. And that is the common formulation that is cited when discussing what this reciprocal relationship looks like in paganism. Now, you'll see that in religions like Christianity, we have concepts like grace, or you have something like John 3:16, where God so loves the world that he gives his only son, so that whoever believes in him won't perish, but will have everlasting life. That's a gift that God is freely giving to you. It is not in exchange for anything. It's not for any goods. It's not for any services rendered. There's nothing like that. It is a one-way street. Well, except for belief, of course. But in this case, in ancient pagan practice, it was all about an exchange of gifts. Another factor is that in ancient pagan religion, it was concerned chiefly with good fortune in this world. It also was concerned with good fortune in the afterworld, but the afterworld in ancient pagan society was much bleaker and gloomier. And until the mystery religions come onto the scene, you kind of just go down to Hades and you're a gibbering shade and you live among the shades and nothing really happens and it's a gloomy existence. And that's kind of that. That's why they put so much emphasis on life here in the now. When they're giving their gifts to the gods, they aren't doing it because they expect the gods to give them a better afterlife. It's because they want something material, like healthy children or bountiful crops or rainfall, these kinds of things that are tangible goods. Now, another feature of the Numinous worldview is that everything can be a sign from the gods. Anything random that happens can be interpreted, if you have the right tools of interpretation, as a sign of the gods. And so this can be the flight of birds, this can be the movement in water, this can be shadows dancing or light or someone sneezing in public at an opportune time. Literally anything can be a sign for the gods if you have the training to interpret those omens. All actions required in some way divine approval. Numen actually comes from the word nuo, which means nod. So the numen is in a way the nod of God. It's the assent that God gives for a specific action. Or if you see, for example, lightning flash, well, the numen of Jupiter is in that because Jupiter has to give his assent. He has to agree that that will happen. And when it does happen, you know that Jupiter is behind it because he gave his approval. And approval and divine favor was obtained through omens, divinations, rituals, and sacrifice. So that is the numinous worldview. Now, what about authority and centralization? This is based on ancestral tradition and it is not based on scriptures. There's no holy book that you can refer to and argue with your father or with the priests and say, look, it says it this, and I think that you're doing it wrong. That's not the way it works. It's the collective wisdom of the community that decides what is right or wrong. There's no holy book or text that determines that. There is, among the Romans, an idea called the mos maiorum, and that is the way of the ancestors, or the custom of the greater ones, is literally what it means. But your duty, your religious duty, is simply to uphold what it is that your ancestors passed down without changing anything. And that is the mos maiorum. So if you take in new gods and you worship new gods, well, that might be a problem for the mos maiorum, but it might not also be, because the ancestors also made provisions sometimes when there were terrible earthquakes or floods or other kinds of natural disasters to bring in foreign deities to help appease the gods and restore the peace of the gods, the pax deorum as it's called. Now, these were also oral cultures. These were face-to-face cultures. And they were not people of the book. So they were highly variable from region to region, and there was not very much centralization in terms of what to believe. The Romans actually had a sacred text that was a collection of hexametrical Greek poetry, and what they did was when there was an omen, like some sort of monstrous birth, let's say a sheep was born with two heads, well, then they would bring in the priests and they would say, we need to consult the Sibylline books, which are a collection of oracles that were passed down from the Sibyl, which is, well, there are many Sibyls, but let's say the Cumaean Sibyl. These are utterances of an oracle that are kind of enigmatic and cryptic and can be used to mean all kinds of things. And the priests would search through the oracles and try to find a passage that spoke to this event. And they would say, if a sheep is born with two heads, then the father of Pan must be brought in to the city. And so they would go and they would consult with each other and find out where they need to get this god, and they would find his image and bring it in to the city and set it up. And in that way, they would try to propitiate the gods so that they wouldn't have these monstrous births anymore. And that's just one of many examples. There are whole collections of books of omenology that have lists of different things like it rained blood on this day, or there was 3 suns seen in the sky, or all kinds of what we would call today unidentified flying objects, but are simply, weather phenomena that are, a rainbow that is just a full circle, also called a glory. And that kind of thing would provoke you to look into the Sibylline books. So that is a very different use of sacred scriptures than the use of the Bible, which is more of a law code in origin. At least the Old Testament is a collection of laws and prophecies, and there's some wisdom literature and some poetry with the Psalms gathered together, and they are used in a way that each letter, each syllable, each word is sacred and has a specific meaning that the priest class can interpret and that preserve the law. But the Sibylline books were not like that. They weren't a book of law. So there was no centralization around specific texts. Then we have as well no separation of religion and politics. So politicians were priests and priests were politicians. There's just no distinct sacred and secular spheres. This is something that is very modern. In fact, It dates back only to the age of the Enlightenment, where we start to get this idea that the secular sphere should be somewhat distinct from religion. There's just no concept that you would separate politics from religion in antiquity. It would have been unfathomable or atheistic in a way that they thought would have horrible consequences, because if the politicians are not involved with the peace of the gods, with the Pax Deorum, then they have no authority really to rule, because that is really the source of their authority is from the gods. The hierarchy stems from the gods. Now, also, we have this system of patronage. So I say that ancient religion operated on principles of a patriarchal patron system. So what is a patron system? The closest analogy that I can think of in modern popular culture is the Godfather. That is, the Godfather sits over there, and if you need something done, you will go to him and you will offer a service in exchange for what he will do for you. And he has much more power and connections. And in exchange, you will work for him and do things for him, and he will be propitious to you, and he will pull some strings and do favors for you. So this is not only the system that was behind religion, but this is also how society in general operated, was through this loosely knit system of patronages. Much of Roman society, much of Greek society operated on these informal bonds of patronage and protection. Also, when we think of something like feudalism in the Middle Ages, it's also the same thing. You have a lord, and if you are a vassal, then you are paying fealty or homage to that particular lord, and he will scratch your back if you scratch his. And you don't have to have only one patron, you can have a whole bunch. And then it's in that network of mutual protections and mutual benefits that society emerges. So religion was not distinct from the political sphere or from the social sphere in that respect. The gods operated on the patronage system just as much as humans did with one another. And it was all about ritual actions that clearly reinforced the hierarchical difference between humans and the gods, and that they are perfect, they are immortal, they are deathless and unchanging, and none of those things. And so it's always trying to reinforce those hierarchies between men, between animals, between the gods. And then I also say that the patriarchal microcosm of the household was reflected in the patriarchal macrocosm of the state. And so in the same way that the pater familias was the ruler of the household and had the power of life and death over his children, over his wife, it was the same with the state, with the emperor or with the senate, who themselves had this power of the father over their subjects. And so in many ways, the house, the lowest irreducible unit in antiquity, was not the individual, at least not until the 2nd century AD. It was the family, and the family referred to not just the people in the family, but the household and all of its property. And then the polis, or the city-state, is itself an aggregate of many different families coalescing together. And so there's a kind of as above, so below sort of fractal way of thinking about ancient Roman religion or ancient Greek religion, as what operates on the lower sphere of the family is also the same sort of organizing principle that governs the state. Now, what about morality? So the ancient gods were rarely understood as shining examples of ethical behavior for humans. Here we have Saturn eating his children. And yes, Saturn is a god. Saturn is perfect. Saturn is worthy of worship. But Saturn eats babies. He eats his own children. Does that mean that you should eat your children because it will make you like a god? Absolutely not. What is for the gods is for the gods, and what is for humans is for humans. And much of ancient religion involves reinforcing that dichotomy, reinforcing the boundaries between the human and the divine. they weren't concerned as much with morality as with respect and piety or dutifulness. So you did not try to be morally pure necessarily to be pleasing to Zeus. What Zeus wanted from you was your sacrifices, was your festival offerings, was your piety. Now, it happens that many positive moral qualities were also pleasing to the gods. So, for example, Zeus Xenios in the Hellenic world was the presider over guest-host relationships. So those who showed hospitality to strangers were pleasing to Zeus because Zeus governs guest-host relationships in his aspect as Zeus Xenios. So it's not so clear that the gods didn't care if you were holy or not. It's that they had very different ideas of what constituted pleasing the gods. They weren't concerned so much about sin as a kind of mortal sin that condemns your soul, but they were more concerned with things like pollution. And that is a temporary kind of pollution of the soul that can be lifted through certain rituals, through purifications like a ritual bath, for example. If you come into contact with a dead body, then you are polluted and you need to do things in order to rid yourself of the pollution so that you can come again into the presence of the gods and offer them your gifts and your sacrifices. So again, the gods are more concerned with reciprocal relationships, festivals and sacrifices, etc. And do ut des, I give so that you may give, is the sentence that you want to know in Latin, because that's really the whole model on which all of ancient religion was built on. Another way, of course, is saying quid pro quo, which is something for something. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. That's really how morality was thought of in antiquity. A pious person was not a person who was free from sin necessarily. It was a person who did their duty to the state, to their family, to their ancestors, and so on. And then lastly, we have time and eschatology. In ancient Greek and Roman religion, there was no concept of eschatology. So what is that? It's an account of the last things. It's the idea that time will eventually end and the world will come to an end and your soul needs to be prepared for that end. They simply just did not think in terms of linear time. That is something that was developed at a much later period. Rather, they had cyclical views of time. Eschatology was brought into Roman religion from Persian Zoroastrianism, who are the original eschatologists, if you will. They're the first people to posit an end times and that there are last things in history and that time is running out or hurling towards some kind of ill-defined end. And then that was eventually adopted by Jewish apocalypticism in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC and AD, a branch of which would go on to become Christianity, which itself is a form of Jewish apocalypticism. And then we get Christian apocalypticism, which spread from there. And that's really where we start to get ideas about linear time, about world history. Before that, everything was more cyclical. It was based on patterns that were repeated in nature. You would look in the sky and you would see that the sun and the moon rotate. They come and they go, and there were the solstices. And these are the kinds of things that ancients understood, and they didn't think that it was ultimately moving towards anything. It was just going to be a kind of eternal recurrence. You are pious towards your ancestors, and hopefully you have lots of children so that they can be pious towards you, propitiate your spirit at your grave, and make sure that you have a nice afterlife, potentially, depending on who we're talking about. So I wanted to give a comment on the word pagan, and that is that this is actually a pejorative term. It's a bad word, but in the same way that the word queer has sort of been rescued by some people and used as an identity, pagan has also been rescued from the dustbin of history, and no longer does it necessarily mean country bumpkin or redneck or rustic, because that's really what pagan means. It comes from pagos, which is related to the word peasant, for example, or paysan, someone who lives in the country. So a paganus is a villager or a rustic. And this is a term that Christians, when they were coming into power in the cities, they had their bishops and they had their churches. The cities were very well Christianized, but still over in the countryside, there were many people who did not convert to Christianity. And so they were referred to somewhat deplorably as paganus, so redneck or country bumpkin. It's a derogatory term. And it has, in more recent decades, been sort of rescued from that. People now use it to identify themselves. Some people don't like it. They prefer the term polytheist. And so I will say that you can use whichever term you want, pagan or polytheist, but to me, they're functionally the same thing. I don't think we need to have this kind of genetic fallacy whereby it's polluted by this original meaning. It's what is being used now. What is the current usage of the word? And that is people use it to self-identify as pagan or as polytheist. And I think that we can do the same. So I will use these terms interchangeably, but just be aware that there are certain strings attached to the use of this word pagan.